Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Iran. Malcolm Hoenlein, Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, joins me. Within these last days, the completion of yet another negotiation, this one in Kazakhstan, between the P5+1, that's the United Nations Security Council, looking to the suspect nuclear weapons program violating the Non-Proliferation Treaty signed by Iran. That treaty is at risk always, especially because there is plenty of information pointing to an underground enrichment facilities throughout Iran. Iran's pushed the limits on the level of enrichment from 3% to 20%, and now suggestions of higher than that. Malcolm, at this point, what do we know about the negotiations? When Kazakhstan ended, there was talk of further conversations in the future. A glimmer of hope, I think, was the headline. Is there a date?
There is no date, and the fact is that the Western partners did not agree to trying to set a date because they were so disappointed again and again and again. And this is the tactic that Iran uses of offering some glimmer or at the very end saying, well, we have something that we want to consider, and setting another date for a technical meeting and then for the P5+1 meeting, or each of which has no real purpose except to extend them, the timeline, and to give them more breathing space to do what they did today in announcing the inauguration of a new uranium mine, a huge one, the biggest one in Iran at Saghand, and the uranium ore concentration production in Arkadan, gaining more and more self-sufficiency, trying to expand the enrichment capacity, as well as their weaponization abilities, recognized by the Senate in a bold move today, which we can talk about. But there's a wide gulf, is the way the parties described the outcome of the talks in Almaty, which had followed talks in Istanbul, which followed talks in Almaty, and which followed 10 years of talks. And they have to be described, again, as a failure. The United States, and Kerry in particular, has said that the time is running out, that the clock is, we know the clock is ticking. He told the Israelis, who kept pressing him, about this apparent open-ended approach. And he said that all the options are on the table, including implying the military option being a serious one. The problem is that clearly the Khamenei's comments would lead to other conclusions. Amano, the head of the IEA, even said that Iran continued the enrichment after 2003 probably, and now comes to recognitions that we've all came to
Malcolm,
many years ago.
I mean, you're just passing by this. That so annoyed me. Yukiya Amano, Director General of the IAEA, says, well, we have no hard evidence that they continued developing weapons after 2003, but we have no transparency, and so we have our doubts whether they ever discontinued.
How about that line? We dealt clean.
During the Bush administration. Malcolm and I dealt with this for years, and we were so careful. We were cautious. You know, the Bush administration, supposedly sympathetic to our argument that Iran was developing nuclear weapons program, and then the IEDs of 2007, still an outrage of American foreign policy under the Bush administration.
And disproven completely, and they themselves have rewritten it. And now Amano, all these years later, comes with this statement today. It was astonishing. I wasn't bypassing it. I was just underscoring
it.
Well,
I just want to run over it here, because this is not about the Obama administration being diplomacy. The Bush administration also used the doubts about the transparency of Iran to continue talks, so that here we are now in the spring of 2013 with John Kerry, who spent all those years in the Senate, by the way, on the Foreign Relations Committee.
Chairman.
He wasn't out of this loop, and he was chairman, along with Joe Biden, the Vice President of the United States, on the Foreign Relations Committee. They're fully apprised of Iran's efforts to deceive the IAEA and to continue the enrichment program. Now, because there are too many villains and there's too little time, let's move to Syria. Within this last week, Al-Qaeda...
Not unrelated, right.
Now, Al-Qaeda makes an announcement that all this time, guess what? Al-Nusrah Front is Al-Qaeda, and it is now the Islamic Republic of in Iraq and the Levant, meaning that they've merged in their minds, in their press releases, Zawahiri of Pakistan, Afghanistan, back and forth, the head of Al-Qaeda, has merged the Iraq Al-Qaeda with the Syrian Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusrah Front. What I'm concerned about is the Golan Heights, Malcolm, because the Syrian army is reported to have left the Golan Heights. That means al-Nusra has moved in, and Israel is now neighbor with al-Qaeda. Is that a fair conclusion with where we are right now?
It's not only a fair conclusion, it's an increasingly more serious conclusion, because we see the rebel groups unidentified at this point, but including many Islamists coming and jihadists coming to closer and closer to the border, because Syrian troops have pulled back into Damascus, where they, by the way, have had some victories, or at least setting back the rebels a bit in Air Force bombing in Latakia, Aleppo, in the eastern provinces, so they're more aggressive, but clearly in more confined areas, leaving areas like the Golan more vulnerable. The border with Jordan and Israel, both more vulnerable, and the United States is training people in Jordan to take over there. But I think the point you raise is so important, and I'm sure, from what I've seen in the media, there's very little notice. This is a message. When the al-Qaeda went public, when al-Nusra, we have discussed from the first days they entered and talked about their connection, if they came out of Iraq, not out of Iran, out of Iraq into
eastern Syria,
into Syria, have been the most aggressive fighters. And there's maybe just 1,000, 2,000 of them, but it doesn't matter. They're very aggressive. They've been moving. They're the ones who attacked the Air Force bases, took over more weapons, therefore more equipped to do some more
IED,
damage.
complex attacks, suicide belts.
Exactly.
The whole,
and maybe even reporting
the MO of al-Qaeda in Iraq.
And what they felt so confident now, that they could go public and say, we are al-Qaeda of Iraq, now al-Qaeda, al-Nusra. Some say they merged, others said that they were always one group all along. And it's an extension of the Islamic State of Iraq, which tells you what's going on in Iraq, and it tells you the reality of what we're going to face in Syria, where there's no one who today can predict what the outcome. We see the Syrian army fighting back in some places, but we see more and more radicalization of the rebel groups, and no control by the Syrian army, not getting the support that many people wanting. The only one who seems to be helping right now is the Israeli army going in and giving medical treatment to people along the border, both rebel and forces.
The scenario now, Malcolm, we've talked for a long time about how the U.S. and other Western powers have prepared special forces in Jordan in the event of the collapse of the Assad regime or chemical weapons are used, weapons of mass destruction. But that picture now looks sentimental, because what we now have are predator groups such as al-Qaeda and its 1,000 fighters times 5,000 ability to recruit in Syria, who have access to the chemical weapons that everybody else has if the Assad regime collapses suddenly. We don't have a simple picture where Assad goes and Syria returns to peace and promise.
He goes to an enclave. He goes into
what we have is a collapse of all order and the arsenals and the chemical weapons, which were passed around and routinely now filtering through all of the ummah from Libya, become much worse.
And much worse, and more sophisticated weapons coming from Libya. The UN today said that 12 countries they're investigating having gotten it. We know more is flowing into the Sinai.
And there's much more in Syria than there ever was in Libya.
Exactly right. And you know what al-Nusra's thing, MO, which is very interesting, is that they targeted the infrastructure, economic infrastructure of Syria. They control 90% of the oil wells. They're now moving into the Raqqa area, which is the area between the two rivers where you have the agriculture, where you have the energy, the economic base. And they are the ones moving to take control of that area, so that they are really building with a long-term vision for the future. As you said, obviously the chemical missiles are all very juicy targets, but they have a much longer goal. And they are trying to control the economic infrastructure, which will put them in a position when Assad falls, to play much bigger role than their numbers.
Malcolm Hoenlein, Conference of Presidents, Major American Jewish Organizations. I'm John Batchelor.